sat around my father's dining room table and voted me out of his inheritance. 5 people, 5 hands raised. Not one person objected. They were so confident that they even opened a bottle of wine afterward. They thought they had just taken everything from me. The house, the property, the business, the money they believed my father had left behind. What they didn't know was that the most valuable thing they were fighting over had already been transferred out of the inheritance 3 years earlier. And it was mine to control. I knew it. My father knew it. He had absolutely no idea. And I had one decision to make. Walk through that door and tell them the truth. Or let them celebrate a victory they had never actually won. I stayed outside. What happened 3 weeks later changed my family forever. My name is Claire. For most of my life, I was the child my family remembered only when they needed something. My father, Walter, had built a successful lakeside inn in North Carolina. He started with almost nothing. One small motel, one highway, and decades of work. By the time he was older, that little motel had become a 42-room lakeside inn sitting on 11 acres of valuable shoreline. Developers had been trying to buy the property for years. My father always refused. He used to say, "This place isn't just property, Claire. It's something I built for the family." I believed him. Maybe that's why I stayed. My older brother Daniel had left home as soon as he could. He built a life in Charlotte and came back mostly for holidays. My younger sister, Patricia, stayed closer to my father, but she wasn't the one running the inn. I was. When Dad's health began to decline, I moved back home. I managed the books. I dealt with suppliers. I handled guests. I fixed problems at 2 in the morning. When my father went through cancer treatment, I was the one driving him to appointments. For months, I slept on a small cot in his den because he was afraid of being alone at night. I didn't do those things because I expected an inheritance. I did them because he was my father. But my brother and sister saw it differently. Daniel started calling me Dad's little shadow. Patricia said I was positioning myself to get everything. I tried to ignore them. Then my father died. He passed quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday morning. I was the one who found him. I was the one who called the funeral home. I was the one who chose the flowers. 9 days after we buried him, my brother called me. I thought he was calling because he was grieving. He wasn't. He told me not to bother coming to the will reading. I asked him why. His answer was simple. We've already talked about it. I remember sitting at my father's kitchen table with the phone against my ear. I asked, "Talked about what?" He said, "We decided you're getting nothing." Then he hung up. That's it. Lifetime of being there for my father. Reduced to a 90-second phone call. For a few minutes, I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive straight to that lawyer's office. I wanted to walk into the room and demand an explanation. But something stopped me. Because my father had once told me something I hadn't thought about in years. 2 years before he died, when his health first began getting worse, he called me into his office late one night. The inn was quiet. Everyone had gone home. Dad looked exhausted. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Claire Bear, I know this family." I smiled. He didn't. He continued. "When I'm gone, they're going to fight over this place." I asked him what he meant. He looked at me and said, "They won't be fighting over what I built. They'll be fighting over what they think it's worth." Then he showed me something. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a legal document involving the property itself. My father had already placed the lakeside inn and its land into a trust. And he had named me as the person responsible for managing it after his death. The property wasn't simply waiting to be divided by a will. It had already been placed outside the estate. Dad had done it years earlier. Quietly. Legally. Without telling Daniel. Without telling Patricia. And he had one reason. He didn't trust them to protect what he had spent his entire life building. I remember asking him, "Why me?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Because if this place was worth nothing, you'd still be here." I didn't understand how important those words were until after he died. 3 weeks after the funeral, my family gathered around the same dining room table where my father had once done the inn's books. They thought they were there to divide his estate. Instead, they decided to remove me from it. Daniel proposed that I should receive nothing because, according to him, I had already benefited from Dad's favoritism. Patricia agreed. And then the others followed. 5 hands went up. 5 votes. They thought they had just erased me. What they didn't know was that they weren't voting on the property they cared about. That property was already controlled by the trust. And I was the trustee. I could have walked into the room. I could have placed the documents on the table. I could have watched their faces collapse. But I didn't. I was sitting in my car outside. I could see them through the window. I watched Daniel laugh. I watched Patricia pour wine. They were celebrating. And for some reason, that hurt more than the inheritance itself. Because my father had only been gone a few weeks. And they were already celebrating what they thought they had taken from him. I drove home that night. I didn't call my brother. I didn't call my sister. I called my father's estate attorney. Her name was Renata. I asked her one question. Can they take the property? She said, no. I asked, can they challenge the trust? She explained that the trust had been established before my father's death, and that the property wasn't being distributed through the will the way my family believed. And she asked me what I wanted to do. I looked out the window at the lake, and I thought about my father. I could keep the inn. I could fight my family. I could spend years in court proving what they already refused to believe. Or I could do something none of them expected. I called a developer who had been trying to buy the property from my father for years. His name was Preston Kellerman. I told him, if your offer is still on the table, I'm ready to talk. It was. But there was something I didn't know yet. Something that became the biggest surprise of the entire story. Preston wasn't planning to destroy the property. He wasn't going to build luxury condos across the shoreline. He had been quietly purchasing shoreline property and placing portions of it into conservation arrangements. He made me an unusual offer. He wanted to preserve the land. Property would become protected shoreline. My father's name would remain attached to it. Memorial marker would stand at the entrance. And once the deal closed, no one in my family would ever be able to fight over that property again. I sat across from Renata and read the proposal twice. Then I started crying. Not because of the money. Because suddenly, I understood what my father had been trying to protect. He hadn't simply wanted me to inherit a valuable piece of land. He wanted someone to make sure his life's work didn't become the reason his children destroyed each other. So I signed. The deal closed 11 days later. And then I waited. 3 weeks passed. Daniel eventually discovered the sale through a public property filing. He drove straight to the inn. He probably expected to see construction crews. Instead, he saw a bronze plaque near the entrance. It carried my father's name. The property had been permanently protected. Daniel called Patricia. Patricia called Renata. They demanded to know how the property could have been sold without their approval. Renata gave them the answer they had never bothered to learn. Will had never controlled that property. He had spent weeks arguing over something that wasn't theirs to divide. Their vote hadn't taken anything from me. It had only exposed what they really wanted. But then Renata discovered something else. Something much darker. While my father was still alive, Daniel and Patricia had tried to move nearly $200,000 from one of his business accounts. He had used an old power of attorney document. The bank had flagged the transfer. Money had been frozen. Nobody in the family had known about it until the financial records were reviewed. That discovery changed everything. Because now this wasn't just a family argument over an inheritance. There was evidence that they had attempted to take money from my father while he was vulnerable. The matter was reported. The consequences came later. Daniel accepted a plea agreement. Tricia fought the charges and lost. And I didn't celebrate. I didn't attend the hearings. I didn't call them afterward. I simply went back to the lake. Because by then, I finally understood what my father had known years earlier. The real inheritance wasn't the money. It wasn't the inn. It wasn't even the land. It was the trust he had placed in one person. Me. My father once asked himself a question. Which one of his children would still be standing beside him if there was nothing left to inherit? He already knew the answer. I think that's why he chose me. Not because I was the favorite. Not because I deserved more. But because I had already proven something. I would show up when there was nothing to gain. My brother and sister showed up when there was something to divide. And that difference told my father everything he needed to know. So when they sat around that table and voted me out, I thought they were humiliating me. They thought they had won. They didn't realize the decision had already been made years earlier. And perhaps the most powerful part of the whole story is this. I never had to tell them they were wrong. Time did that for me. The documents did that. The truth did that. And in the end, the family didn't lose what they thought they had inherited. They lost the opportunity to turn my father's legacy into a battlefield. And maybe that was exactly what he wanted. If you were Claire, what would you have done? Would you have walked into that room and exposed the trust immediately? Or would you have stayed silent and let them celebrate their imaginary victory? Tell me in the comments. If you enjoy family betrayal stories where the truth isn't revealed until the very end, subscribe to Kinfolk Confession. Because sometimes, person everyone thinks is lost is the only person who already knows how the story ends. Thanks for watching.